As war loomed in Europe, the Royal Navy realized that it was woefully short of escort vessels, especially for the east coast of Britain. The Admiralty dawdled until 1939, when things became pressing. What followed was a design that was cheap, small, and packed a hefty punch to deal with the U-boat threat, which was an all-too-fresh wound from the First World War. The convoy escorts would be the Flower-class corvettes. These fishing trawlers, although slow, poorly armed for surface combat, or any threats from the air, proved to be one of the most decisive factors in the Atlantic theater. Their sonar and ready supply of depth charges proved to be more than a match for the Kriegsmarine's U-boats. In today's video, we'll take a look at the Flower-class corvettes, and how these whaling trawlers saved Britain in the Second World War. Like I mentioned in the introduction, the Royal Navy was woefully short of convoy escorts and had the foresight to see that they needed to produce more. It just so happened to not come quite urgently enough. Real plans didn't get going until February 1939, when things appeared like they were going to get heated in Europe. The Admiralty looked to create a small vessel, and turned to many such builders in Britain, where 6 options were put forward. The first being converted trawlers of 620 tons, 11 to 12 knots, and costing £3,500 and 4 weeks for conversion. The second was a commercial trawler built to the Admiralty's specifications, 510 tons, 12 knots, and costing £57,500, each taking 6 months to build. Third, Smith's Dock's Southern Pride type trawler, 700 tons, 16 knots, and costing £75,000 and 7 months to build. Fourth, a whaler type built to Admiralty specifications, 700 tons, 16 knots, and costing £90,000 and 7 months to build. Fifth, a 1939 minesweeper design A/S version of Bangalore class, 500 tons, 17 knots, costing £135,000 and taking 8 months to build. Finally, a simplified design of a coastal sloop, 580 tons, 20 to 21 knots, costing £160,000 and 8 months to build. The Admiralty talked to representatives from Smith's Dock, which specialized in trawler-sized vessels and builders of the Southern Pride type, which were the starting point for the Flower class. Smith's Dock had never built a warship, but as I mentioned, they were very good at building trawler-sized vessels, so essentially whaling or fishing boats. By April 13th, the Admiralty had taken the decision to proceed with the Smith's Dock's whaler and future anti-submarine patrol vessel design, where changes were needed to be made to fit the needs of the Navy. Early on, the specifications for the ship were as follows: a standard displacement of around 940 tons and just under 1,200 tons full load, having 2 Scotch boilers that powered a single triple expansion engine, producing around 2,750 horsepower, giving the ship a top speed of 16 knots. They were armed with a single 4-inch gun, some 50 caliber machine guns, and some smaller caliber Lewis machine guns. They also carried a pair of depth charge launchers and 2 depth charge rails with between 25 and 40 depth charges on board. The ships also carried some very basic sonar and radar equipment. As the war went on, the ships would be modified even more, with more anti-aircraft and anti-submarine warfare equipment being added. 296 ships of this class were built, while 36 would be destroyed in the course of the war. Now, the first ships of the class weren't great, and it took some adjustments before they could really get going. We're to take from Atlantic escort ships Weapons and Tactics in World War II by David Brown. The first 50 ships had no thermal insulation on the ship's side, and this, combined with poor ventilation, led to heavy condensation, which, together with leaky seams, contributed to a high incidence of tuberculosis. 7 petty officers shared a toilet and 3 wash basins. The ratings quarters measured about 22 feet by 30 feet for 55 men, with a single urinal, 2 toilets, and 4 wash bowls. Sleeping quarters were in 2 compartments of 22 feet by 14 feet on the lower deck, making escape difficult. There was a single small galley at the after end of the superstructure, and all food had to be carried across the open well deck, frequently swept by heavy seas, to the forecastle. There was a single small refrigerator. Fresh food would be gone in about 5 days, after which only tinned supplies were available. Seasickness reduced the need for eating. A considerable improvement was made by extending the forecastle to amidships in 1941 to 1942. This helped keep the deck dry and made extra space available for accommodation. There was a slight offset in that the extra weight forward reduced the freeboard. There were complaints about the bridge layout, small chart room, where the Aztec was, and so on. Like I mentioned before, as the war went on, improvements were made to the design. And like a snowflake, not every Flower-class corvette was the same, having improvement after improvement during the war. Before we continue on with the ship's general activities in the war, it is important to discuss the ship's designation as a corvette. This designation has nothing to do with the previous one used to describe small warships in earlier periods. The term sloop was being used to describe a lot of small vessels in the Royal Navy, so they needed an intermediate designation of something smaller than a destroyer but bigger than a sloop, so they used corvette. As other ships that were larger than a corvette and smaller than a destroyer came along, they used the term frigate. The ship served in a number of navies during the war, with the Royal Navy, Royal Canadian Navy, Royal New Zealand Navy, Royal Norwegian Navy, Royal Yugoslav Navy, South African Navy, Royal Netherlands Navy, Royal Indian Navy, Royal Hellenic Navy, Free Belgian Navy, Marine Nationale, and United States Navy, as well as the Kriegsmarine, as some of this class were being built in France, as the nation fell to the invading German forces. They would fall into the hands of the German occupiers and be used as patrol craft, which is quite interesting, having the same class of ships serving on both sides of the war. Please let me know if there are any other ship classes that served in both the Axis and Allied navies down in the comments. Off the top of my head, one that comes to mind after the war is the Prince Eugen, as she was commissioned into the United States Navy. While serving in the Royal Navy, being the Flower class, they were named after flowers like azalea, hibiscus, honeysuckle, and petunia. While in the United States Navy, the ships were called the Action class, with some pretty cool names like Fury, Restless, Saucy, a personal favorite of mine, and Tenacity. The most notable place the Flower class saw service was in the Battle of the Atlantic, as well in other theaters of the war like the Mediterranean. In the Battle of the Atlantic, the main opponent of the Flower class was the German U-boats. Now, if a U-boat was surfaced and spotted, the Flower class would usually charge the surfaced U-boat and attempt to make it dive so that its speed and maneuverability was reduced, and then they would take it under depth charge attack to either sink it or keep it preoccupied so the convoy wasn't attacked. The corvette captains also had to take into consideration how far they chased the U-boat. As I mentioned, they weren't exactly the fastest ships and had to keep up with the convoy, so the Flowers were mainly focused on keeping the U-boats away from the merchant vessels. While in the Atlantic, as for most other sailors serving in this theater, things were usually pretty wet. Pretty wet and cold. But especially so in the Flower class, as the ships would tend to have a lot of water on their bows as the ships went through the ocean, along with generally being a pretty cramped ship to live on. Later, Flower-class corvettes saw modifications to the size of the ship to accommodate for this. Being based on a trawler design, it meant that the ships were very adept at traveling at sea, but had a tendency to roll quite violently, although not actually capsizing. The ships were fairly successful at hunting down and sinking Axis submarines, helping to sink at least 51 of them. As the war continued, each of the Flower class was fairly unique, as each ship had individual adaptations like additional radar and sonar, along with the changes to the mess galley, just to name a few. The Flower class's construction ceased near the end of the war, to be followed by the larger River-class frigates and improved Castle-class corvettes. I think an important question we should ask is just how effective were these ships? Well, Brown writes, "The efficiency of an anti-submarine system depends on the performance of the ship, the effectiveness of its sensors and weapons, and on the skill of its crew. The economical use of manufacturing facilities is another part of the story. Finally, it must be reemphasized that the object is the safe and timely arrival of cargoes." Another interesting comparison is between the Flowers and the Rivers. They had the same ASDIC and depth charge armament, both receiving a Hedgehog as available. The Rivers were faster, but used 2 engines, a bottleneck in escorting building. The Rivers were much more successful killers than the Flowers, but they used twice as many scarce resources without scoring twice as many kills. Collingwood's detailed analysis, with months in commission per sinking, gives 119.6 for the Flowers and 79.7 for the Rivers, a broadly similar conclusion. Both analyses use sinking as a measure of effectiveness, which grossly underestimates the value of the Flowers, because with early short-range ASDICs, 2 sets are better than 1. 2 ships are also more effective than 1 in keeping submarines submerged, limiting their mobility. One may conclude that the early years of the war, the Admiralty at least, were correct in building the simpler, single-engine ships. So, these cheap little vessels were quite effective in the U-boat campaign. Of course, I can't do a video on the Flower class without mentioning one of the best books, albeit fiction, The Cruel Sea by Nicholas Montserrat. There was a movie adaptation which was also excellent. The book follows the men of the Royal Navy who serve in the escort force during the Battle of the Atlantic, so the main stomping grounds of the Flower class, in which they serve. The primary ships of the book are Compass Rose and later the River-class frigate Saltash. The story centers around Lieutenant Commander George Erickson and his largely inexperienced crew and how they manage the grinding, monotonous, and exhausting reality of convoy escort duty. There are long periods of boredom punctuated by the sudden and all too real terror of a U-boat attack, brutal North Atlantic weather, and constant fatigue because the men are always on guard whether actually at their post or not. The sudden terror really eats at them. The book does a great job of illustrating how terrible combat in the Atlantic was, emphasizing the slow, wearing down effect of the war on the ordinary sailor. Pressure makes diamonds, as they say, and for George Erickson and his men, they learn to do their jobs under the pressure and form a great bond through the shared hardship. I won't spoil anything, but genuinely, this is an excellent book and an excellent movie adaptation that I highly recommend. I hope you all enjoyed this somewhat shorter video on the Flower class. They are an interesting little class. Along with any small escort vessels that participated in the Battle of the Atlantic, I think that last quote by Brown really illustrates how important these cheap, small, and effective convoy escorts were, being able to turn the tide of the battle. Please remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. And until next time, my friends, have a great day.